Hi everyone, I'm James Davies and welcome to the first video in our Kinetic Platform Orientation Series. We highly recommend that anyone who is about to get started with Kinetic watch this video to get a better understanding for the problems that we set out to solve when we built our platform, as well as some first principles that we believe are critical for getting your digital experience right. This should be a pretty quick video, but it will help set some context for the rest of the videos you'll watch in this orientation series, so you know how we think when we're architecting the platform. I want to start by giving some context and talking about the problems that we set out to solve. At a high level, for over the last 20 years, we've been working with some of the world's largest organizations to help them streamline their processes. And what we saw was in these large organizations, they have dozens, if not hundreds of different applications that they use on a day-to-day basis to automate and streamline their processes. What happens though when you have all of these different applications behind the scenes is that your users, your end users, which could be customers or vendors or citizens if you're a state and local government, or partners, they have to interact with many of these different applications at times, which means that might have to start a process in system A. Maybe that's filling out a PDF and emailing it to a team. And then once that's done, they've got to take that same information and forward it on to team B to get that end-to-end process completed, which leads to a disjointed user experience. The other thing that winds up happening here is each of these different back-end applications winds up having its own user experience, which has to be highly tailored and customized, which is extremely expensive. And so really what we wanted to solve for is how can we provide a streamlined user experience to anyone that's interacting with your organization, and then reduce the licensing costs that are needed behind the scenes, as well as the labor costs that are needed to customize these different platforms behind the scenes. And so ultimately what we came up with over the last 15 years was developing a composable and modular digital experience platform. And that's a new layer that sits between your end-to-end users and the different back-end systems that exist within your environment. Those back-end systems might be modern SaaS apps like a Salesforce or ServiceNow, or they might be legacy applications like mainframes that are extremely costly and risky to replace. And so if we can just provide a veneer on top of them to provide a better user experience, we give the appearance of modernization within your environment. And then slowly behind the scenes, you can start to decouple and deconstruct those applications and migrate them to something that might be more modern. This ultimately gives you the ability to change out the different back-end systems that are supporting your organization so that you can have best-of-breed tools behind the scenes without affecting your user experience or having to retrain your users each time. And then ultimately it lowers licensing costs because you don't necessarily have to license a user in 3 or 4 different tools behind the scenes. They're able to interact with a digital experience platform that's got a great user experience for exactly what their persona is. And then behind the scenes, we can route that work to the right systems of record. And so that's ultimately kind of in a nutshell what Kinetic Data is or what our platform does. So with that in mind, let's talk through some of the requirements or key principles that we think are really important when selecting a digital experience platform. You can think of Kinetic as really a back-end as a service. And I think this image of an iceberg really helps to paint the picture of what it is that we do. Think of Kinetic as everything below the line, the water line. Those are things that most users don't see. It's 80+% of all of the effort. Probably pretty low value items that Kinetic is providing, but things that every application needs. Think of things like data storage and how do we authenticate and how do we integrate? How do we handle errors? And so Kinetic is providing, think of that as plumbing behind the scenes. And then the developers that build on top of our platform are building, I'll say, bespoke or tailored applications for their end users. And that's where all of the value is. That's what end users will see. There's tons of value there. And it's not very repetitive. You're typically building that front-end experience for a set of users, and then it stays fairly static over time, but you may need multiple front ends for these back-end tools. So Kinetic is providing that back-end as a service, and we try to keep that in mind and take all of the opinion out of the front end so that you as a developer that's building on the Kinetic platform aren't fighting the platform. You're just leveraging it so that you don't have to manage backups and work with a DBA. We're handling kind of all of that back end stuff for you, and you're just concentrating on building the best front end possible for your end users and your organization. Another key thing that we think is really, really important here is multi-tenancy. So in this image, what's on the left is single tenants, and that's what most applications that you'll see in this space are. They have each customer gets their own set of infrastructure, which includes app servers and databases, and then the users will interact with those. The challenge with that is it becomes very expensive, especially in a large organization that may have multiple tenants that need to be split up. And so what Kinetic did is we're providing multi-tenancy. So end users are interacting with the same application and the same database behind the scenes in a horizontally scalable, highly available way, which reduces the overall cost of running the application, especially for large, complex organizations or managed service provider organizations that have lots of customers. Another thing that we always emphasize when we're about to release a new feature or put some new functionality in the platform is how is this going to affect performance? Given that fact that we are multi-tenanted, we need to make sure that what one tenant does cannot affect the performance of another tenant. And so one of the things that we find is very valuable is this concept of horizontal scaling. In traditional applications, they're vertical scaling. Again, as they get larger, you need more more compute and more memory to run those applications. And eventually you can't buy a server that's big enough. Kinetic, alternatively, architected for horizontal scaling, which means you can add commodity servers, so cheap servers over and over again as you need more bandwidth or more compute power or memory within the application. So that's a key thing to keep in mind is that everything that we're building here for end users needs to have fast performance, because if you don't have fast performance, you'll have a poor user experience. And if you have a poor user experience, no one's actually going to use the application. So we think about performance day one. So as we're developing in the application as well, you'll notice that even at development time, the performance will match what's out in production when you have millions of records in the system and transactions being processed. Another thing that we find or believe is very important within the platform is to use open source technologies. Because this is the user experience layer, we believe that the customer ultimately should own that user experience. And so if they replaced Kinetic, they could repoint their front end to a different digital experience platform, but they own that code. And we want that code to be written in open source languages like JavaScript or React.js, so that developers that maybe have just gotten out of a React bootcamp can get up and running within the platform really quickly. And they're ultimately just working it with our APIs in their existing development environments. We can plug into existing CI/CD processes. We're not bringing any opinion to the front end. And you don't have to go to, I'll say, Kinetic school to learn some Kinetic specific language for 6 months before you can get started. So we are optimized for web developers to be able to get up and running really quick to start creating front ends. And then they just call into our APIs to facilitate integrations or pull back data, etc. And then unleashing the developer. We don't want to make our platform something that engineers or developers have to fight against. We found in the low-code space, especially in large, complex enterprises, that developers wind up fighting low-code platforms more than they help them. And so Kinetic is ultimately providing a lowest common denominator set of components within our platform that developers can then leverage as building blocks to create their front-end application. So you'll see different areas in the application where we'll let a developer kind of break a workflow because they need to break it in order to fix it. We don't add a lot of restrictions within the platform, and that's by design because, again, our key builder target is a front-end developer, someone that is smart and understands business logic and understands how applications work. And so we've removed kind of some of the traditional restrictions that you see in other applications. And it's just important to keep that in mind as you're developing, because your app you're building might get into a broken state, but it's on purpose so that it can get into a broken state so you can fix it. So just keep that in mind as you're going through the rest of this orientation series. And that's it. Those are kind of some of the key foundational principles and some context for why we built the platform. We hope you enjoy the rest of the orientation series.